The Hydra explained. A beast of many heads or a single regenerating plague? We are told the story of a monstrous serpent, lurking in the swamps of Lerna, with a multitude of heads that would regrow, doubled, whenever one was severed. A beast with a single immortal head, and breath so venomous it could kill a man with a single whiff. It is a tale of a monstrous challenge, a seemingly impossible foe for the great hero Heracles to overcome. But what if the beast itself was a misinterpretation of the true horror? What if the Hydra was not the creature, but the disease? A single, intelligent, and fiercely regenerative plague that could infect and corrupt any living thing, turning the swamp itself into its body, and its victims into its ever-sprouting heads. Today, we journey to the dark, toxic marshes of Lerna. But we are not hunting a simple monster. We are investigating the epicenter of a supernatural contagion. This is a story not of a many-headed serpent, but of a sentient regenerative cancer upon the land. A story of a hero who did not just fight a beast, but performed a desperate, fiery act of cauterization to stop a plague from consuming the world. Welcome to Mythos Unveiled. Today, we seek to explain the Lernaean Hydra, not as a beast of many heads, but as a single, terrifying, and ever-growing plague. Part 1. The Monstrous Lineage and the Poisoned Land. To understand the true nature of the horror that awaited Heracles in the swamps of Lerna, we must first journey back into the darkest corners of Greek cosmogony, into the monstrous genealogies that predate the reign of the Olympian gods. For the Hydra was not a creature born of this world. It was an echo of an older, more chaotic time, a living relic of a war that had shaken the heavens, and its very bloodline is a tapestry of monstrous horror, a veritable who's who of primordial nightmares. It was the offspring of two of the most terrible and awe-inspiring beings in the Greek cosmos, Typhon and Echidna. Typhon, the colossal, fire-breathing father of all monsters, was a creature of such immense size and power that his head was said to brush against the stars. He had 100 dragon heads, each one speaking in a different, terrifying voice, and from his eyes flashed a burning, hellish fire. He was a being of pure elemental chaos, a force so potent that he once challenged Zeus himself for dominion of the heavens in a cataclysmic battle that nearly unmade the world, a battle that left scars on the very face of the earth. And his mate, Echidna, the mother of all monsters, was a creature of a different, more insidious terror. From the waist up, she was a beautiful, captivating nymph. But from the waist down, she was a monstrous, speckled, and coiling serpent. She was a being of duality, of deception, a beautiful face hiding a monstrous, predatory nature. She dwelled in a deep, dark cave, luring unsuspecting travelers to their doom. Their children, born of this union of overwhelming force and cunning deception, were a gallery of horrors, each one a unique and terrifying threat to the burgeoning order of the world. There was Cerberus, the famous three-headed hound who guards the gates of the underworld, ensuring that the dead remain dead. There was Orthrus, the two-headed dog who guarded the red cattle of the giant Geryon. There was the Chimera, the fire-breathing monstrosity with the head of a lion, the body of a goat, and the tail of a serpent. And there was the Lernaean Hydra, their sibling, a being born of pure, primal, and chaotic monstrosity. But the Hydra was different. While its siblings were singular, albeit terrifying, beasts, each a unique, self-contained entity, the Hydra was something more insidious. It was not just a creature. It was a principle of unending, regenerative, and venomous life. And it was chosen by a goddess to be a weapon. It was sent by the goddess Hera, the ever-wrathful queen of the gods, to the swamps of Lerna with a specific malevolent purpose. Lerna, located in the fertile Argolid, was not just any swamp. It was a sacred place, a region of immense fertility and life, known for its clear, life-giving springs and its deep, mysterious lake, which was said to be a bottomless entrance to the underworld itself. It was a place where the boundaries between the world of the living and the world of the dead were thin. Hera, in her eternal, burning hatred for Heracles, the living, breathing symbol of her husband Zeus's constant infidelity, chose this sacred place to be the site of her revenge. She placed the Hydra there as a blight, a poison, a living, growing corruption upon this sacred land, and she wove it into the threads of fate, ensuring that Heracles would one day have to face this horror as his second labor, a task she hoped would be his last. This is the traditional story, but let us unveil the deeper, more terrifying truth. What if Hera, in her divine wisdom and cold fury, did not place a simple beast in the swamp? What if she introduced something far more subtle and far more dangerous? A spore, a single, intelligent, and supernaturally regenerative cell of pure chaos, born from the venomous blood of Typhon and the monstrous, serpentine flesh of Echidna. This spore, let us call it the Lernaean blight, did not grow into a single self-contained creature. It was far more insidious than that. It infected the swamp itself. It seeped into the clear waters of the springs, into the rich soil, into the roots of the ancient looming cypress trees. The swamp of Lerna, a place of vibrant life, became its new, unwilling body. The waters became its circulatory system, carrying its poison to every corner of the marsh. The dark, tangled woods became its hunting ground. The entire ecosystem, over time, began to transform, becoming a single, vast, and malevolent organism. The air itself grew thick and toxic. The famous springs that once gave life now bubbled with a black, poisonous ichor, and the very ground seemed to breathe with a slow, patient, and eternally hungry intelligence. The blight was a sentient, supernatural cancer, and its primary function, like any cancer, was to grow, to spread, to corrupt, and, most importantly, to defend itself. But how does a sentient swamp defend itself? How does a plague attack its enemies? It creates antibodies, creates soldiers, it creates heads. When a Creaturia wild boar foraging for roots, a great stag coming to drink from the poisoned water, even a lost human traveler wandered too close to the heart of the swamp, it would be infected. The venomous, hazy air would weaken it, clouding its mind. The poisoned water would sicken it, breaking down its will. The blight would then assimilate it. The creature's body would be broken down by the swamp's corrosive enzymes, its flesh and bone used as raw material, its life force consumed as energy. And from the murky, bubbling surface of the swamp, a new, terrible appendage would grow. This was the origin of the heads. They were not part of a central, serpentine body, all attached to a single torso. They were individual, corrupted, and semi-sentient organisms, grown from the swamp's own biomass, all psychically connected to the central, intelligent consciousness of the Lernaean blight. They appeared as great, serpentine necks with fearsome, dragon-like heads, because the serpent was the primal, monstrous form of their genetic mother, Echidna. Each head was a separate tentacle, a defensive turret grown to protect the central nexus of the plague, and each one was filled with a venom so potent, so deadly, it was the very essence of the blight itself. The local villagers who lived on the edges of the swamp, in their terror, saw only these terrifying, snake-like heads rising from the water to snatch their livestock and any foolish traveler who strayed too close. They saw a many-headed serpent. They could not comprehend that the true monster was the very ground beneath their feet, the water in their streams, the very air they breathed. And the blight learned. It was an intelligent, adaptive organism. It learned from its encounters. It learned that to defend itself better, One of its heads needed to be more resilient, a central command unit, a queen in this horrific biological chess game. And so it grew a special head. It took the most powerful life force it had ever consumed, perhaps a demigod who had foolishly tried to cleanse the swamp, or a great, ancient nature spirit that had been corrupted by the poison and used that potent, divine energy to weave an enchantment of immortality into the very fabric of one of its creations. This became the immortal head, the central processing unit of the sentient plague, the one that could not be destroyed by conventional means. This was the true horror that awaited Heracles. Not a simple beast, however large or fearsome, but a sentient, self-replicating, and highly toxic ecosystem, a biological battlefield where the very ground was his enemy, and every drop of water was a potential deadly poison. He was not just going to fight a monster. He was going to fight the land itself. Part 2. The hero's arrival and the impossible foe. Into this poisoned and corrupted land, a new force arrived. Heracles, the son of Zeus, the mightiest of all mortal heroes, a being whose strength was a legend even among the gods. He came to Lerna not by choice, but by decree. This was to be his second labor, a task assigned to him by the whimpering, cowardly King Eurystheus of Mycenae, who, under the subtle and malevolent influence of the goddess Hera, hoped this impossible challenge would finally be the end of Zeus's mighty, illegitimate son. Heracles was accompanied by his loyal nephew, Iolaus, who drove his chariot and served as his squire, a mortal presence in a world of divine conflict. Heracles was a being of immense, almost unimaginable strength, but he was also a skilled hunter with keen, sharp senses, honed by a lifetime of battling monstrous beasts. As he and Iolaus approached the swamps of Lerna, he could feel the profound, unnatural wrongness of the place. The air, which should have been filled with the rich, loamy scent of life and damp earth, was instead thick and acrid, burning his lungs and making his eyes water with its toxic chemical tang. The silence was the most unsettling part. It was not the vibrant, buzzing, chirping silence of a healthy swamp, teeming with hidden life. It was a dead, stagnant silence, the silence of a place where life had been corrupted, twisted, and silenced. With a warrior's keen instinct for survival, Heracles took a piece of his own tunic and, dipping it in a clean stream before they entered the blighted lands, he covered his mouth and nose with the damp cloth. It was a simple, practical act to protect himself from the noxious fumes, but it was, in fact, his first successful, if unwitting, defense against the airborne vector of the Lernaean blog. He did not seek out a single large beast. His hunter senses told him the threat was more diffuse, more pervasive. He followed the trail of corruption itself, the blackened, lifeless trees, the streams that ran with a dark, oily sheen, the bleached bones of livestock and wild animals that littered the swamp's edge to its source. He was led to a dark, bubbling, and foul-smelling spring, a place that felt like the weeping heart of the poisoned land. This was the Hydra's lair, the epicenter of the Lernaean blight. To force his enemy to reveal itself, to draw it out from its shadowy, subterranean hiding place, he used a tactic as old as warfare itself: fire. He knocked several arrows, wrapped their tips in cloth soaked in oil, and, lighting them from a torch held by Iolaus, he fired these flaming projectiles deep into the dark recesses of the swamp. He did not anger a beast. He agitated the entire sentient ecosystem. The swamp itself seemed to groan, a deep, guttural sound that came not from a single throat, but from the earth itself. The bubbling of the spring grew more violent, and from the murky, sulphurous water, the heads began to rise. At first, there was only one, a great, serpentine neck emerging from the water, its reptilian head turning, its black, intelligent eyes fixing on the hero. Then another and another. 9 of them in total, a writhing, hissing forest of muscular necks, their fangs dripping a black, virulent poison that sizzled and steamed as it touched the water. They moved with a terrifying, unified purpose, their heads swaying in unison, all controlled by a single, unseen, and malevolent consciousness. Heracles, undaunted, strode forward to meet his foe. He was a force of nature in his own right, his demigod strength a match for any monster. He waded into the shallow, poisoned water, his mighty club, a weapon he had fashioned himself from a single, massive olive tree, held ready. He roared his own challenge, a sound that rivaled the hissing of the 9 heads. He swung his club with a force that could shatter boulders, and with a crushing, bone-shattering blow, he smashed the first head into a mangled, unrecognizable pulp of flesh and bone. A moment of grim triumph. But then, the true horror of his opponent, the terrible, supernatural logic of the plague, revealed itself. From the bleeding, mangled stump where one head had been, 2 new heads began to sprout with horrifying, unnatural speed. They grew like time-lapsed fungi, writhing and hissing, their eyes burning with the same shared, malevolent intelligence as the others. He had not wounded his enemy. He had made it stronger. He had pruned the beast, and in doing so had encouraged a more vigorous and more numerous growth. This was the terrifying genius of the Lernaean blight. It was not just regenerative. It was multiplicative. It followed a terrifying, cancerous logic. Any attempt to destroy it through simple, brute force would only cause it to grow, to spread, to become more powerful. Every blow Heracles struck was feeding the very thing he was trying to kill, triggering its defensive, reproductive mechanism. He fought with a desperate, growing fury, his club a blur of motion. He crushed another head, and 2 more grew in its place. He smashed another, and 2 more erupted from the stump, hissing and snapping at him with their venomous fangs. The number of his enemies was growing exponentially. The air filled with their hissing, their venomous, poisonous breath so potent that it was a weapon in itself, causing him to choke and his vision to swim. He was being overwhelmed, not by a single beast, but by a self-replicating, endless army of serpentine horrors. And the blight had another ally. Hera, watching the battle from her throne on high, not content to let the Hydra fight alone, sent a second creature to aid it, a giant crab named Karkinos. It scuttled from the swamp's murky depths, a loyal servant of the corrupted land, and attacked Heracles, its great pincers snapping at his feet, trying to throw him off balance, to make him stumble into the poisoned water where the blight's power was at its strongest. This was not just a random monster. It was another manifestation of the corrupted ecosystem, a native crustacean that had been assimilated by the blight and turned into a weapon, a perfectly timed distraction to protect the main body of the plague. Heracles, in a fit of rage and frustration, crushed the giant crab under his mighty heel, its shell cracking like thunder. But the distraction had nearly cost him dearly, as one of the serpent heads lunged and its venomous fangs grazed his shoulder, the poison instantly searing his skin like fire. He was losing. His strength, for the first time in his life, was not enough. He was fighting a battle he could not win, a foe that grew stronger from his every attack. He was facing an impossible and ever-growing enemy. Part 3. The Wisdom of Man, the Purification of Fire. Heracles, the son of Zeus, the mightiest of heroes, was faltering. The air was a toxic haze of venom and swamp gas, burning his lungs with every ragged breath. The water around his legs was a cold, poisonous soup, and the hissing of the ever-multiplying heads was a maddening chorus of death. For every head he crushed with his immense strength, 2 more would erupt, more vigorous, more aggressive than the one before. He was trapped in a horrifying, unwinnable battle of attrition, his legendary strength now a liability, a tool that was only feeding the growth of his monstrous foe. The Lernean blight was adapting to his assault, and he was beginning to tire. It was in this moment of desperate, near-fatal crisis that the tide of the battle was turned, not by the strength of a demigod, but by the mind of a mortal. Iolaus, Heracles' loyal nephew and charioteer, had been watching the horrific battle from the safety of the swamp's edge, his heart filled with a growing terror. He saw his heroic uncle, the strongest man in the world, being overwhelmed. He saw the logic of the monster, the terrible, cancerous mathematics of its regeneration. And he understood, with a flash of brilliant human insight, that this was not a foe that could be bludgeoned into submission. His mind raced, not with the battle fury of a god, but with the practical, problem-solving intellect of a man. He had seen fire. He had seen its power. He had seen how the farmers in his homeland would burn the stumps of felled trees to prevent them from sprouting new shoots. He had seen how shepherds would use a hot iron to cauterize a wound on a sheep, searing the flesh to stop the bleeding and prevent infection. It was a principle of purification, of using one elemental force to conquer and seal another. "Uncle!" he cried out, his voice cutting through the hissing din with a desperate clarity. "You cannot kill it by striking. Your strength only makes it stronger. We must burn it. We must cauterize the wounds as you make them." Heracles, his lungs burning, his body bruised and poisoned, heard his nephew's words, and in his battle-addled mind, the simple, brilliant logic of the idea took root. It was a race against time, a new, desperate strategy in a battle that was nearly lost. While Heracles, with a great roar, renewed his assault, fighting to keep the writhing mass of heads at bay, Iolaus, with immense courage, acted. He abandoned the safety of the chariot and, taking up a torch, he ran to a nearby grove of dead, dry trees at the edge of the swamp. He set the woods alight, and soon, a great roaring bonfire was blazing, its clean, purifying heat a stark contrast to the cold, venomous air of the swamp. They fell into a brutal, exhausting, but perfectly synchronized rhythm. It was a dance of destruction and purification, of divine strength and human ingenuity. Heracles would swing his mighty olive-wood club, smashing one of the serpent heads into a broken, bleeding pulp. Then, in the split second before the blight's regenerative power could take hold, before the new heads could begin to sprout, Iolaus would rush in with a flaming brand plucked from the bonfire. He would thrust the torch into the mangled, writhing stump, searing the flesh. The sound was a terrible hissing and sizzling, the smell of burning monster flesh filling the air. The wound blackened and bubbled under the intense heat. The supernatural regenerative properties of the Lernean blight, this unholy life force, were neutralized by the purifying, cauterizing power of fire. The wound was sealed. No new heads could grow. Smash and burn. Smash and burn. It was a gruesome, terrible, but stunningly effective form of supernatural surgery. One by one, they began to systematically destroy the serpent heads, the defensive tentacles of the Great Plague. The hissing of the creature, which had been a sound of aggressive, confident fury, now turned into a sound of true pain and desperation, a chorus of agony that echoed across the poisoned swamp. The remaining heads fought with a new, frantic energy, recognizing that their enemy had found a way to inflict true, permanent damage. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of battle, only one head remained. The immortal one, the golden-crowned central command unit of the Blight. Heracles knew his club would be useless against this one, and Iolaus' fire could not destroy that which could not die. He dropped his club, now battered and splintered from the battle. He drew his mighty, curved golden sword, a divine weapon that had been a gift to him from the goddess Athena herself. With a great cry, a prayer to his divine father Zeus on his lips, he lunged forward. With all his demigod strength, he swung the enchanted blade, and with a flash of golden light, he severed the final immortal head from its neck. The great serpentine neck collapsed back into the murky water. But the head itself, even separated from its body, from the swamp, from the blight, continued to live. It fell to the ground, its eyes glowing with a malevolent, unkillable light, its fangs snapping and hissing at the air. Could not die, but it could be imprisoned. Working together, the exhausted hero and his nephew dug a deep pit in the earth, far from the swamp's edge, under the path of a sacred roadway where travelers would pass, their footsteps a constant weight upon the prison. They threw the still-living, immortal head inside, and then, with a great, combined effort, they rolled a massive, heavy boulder on top of the pit, trapping the immortal consciousness of the Hydra, sealing it away from the world, a silent, buried, and eternal threat. The great battle was finally over. Part 4. The Tainted Victory, the Weaponized Plague. The battle was over. The silence that fell over the swamp of Lerna was profound, broken only by the crackling of Iolaus' bonfire and the ragged, exhausted breaths of the two heroes. The writhing, multiplicative horror was gone. The immortal consciousness of the Lernean blight was safely imprisoned beneath a great, unmovable stone. Victory had been achieved. But the cost of this victory, and its terrible, lasting consequences, were only just beginning to unfold. Heracles, the victorious son of Zeus, stood over the headless, twitching, and now inert body of the Hydra. He looked at the black, venomous, and unholy blood, the very essence of the blight, pooling in the swamp, turning the water into a dark, oily slick. And in his pragmatic warrior's mind, an idea took hold. He was a hero, but a practical one. He understood that such a potent, supernatural substance, a poison created by the queen of the gods herself, should not go to waste. It was a power that could and should be turned against his future enemies. He made a fateful decision, one that would define the rest of his legendary and tragic life. He took his arrows, the same arrows he had used to slay the monstrous Stymphalian birds, and one by one, he carefully, deliberately, dipped their tips into the Hydra's deadly, black blood. The venom did not seem to harm the arrowheads, but it coated them in a shimmering, dark film, a substance so toxic that the very air around it seemed to warp and recoil. He had not just defeated his enemy, he had weaponized it. He now possessed arrows so deadly, so supernaturally toxic, that the slightest scratch from one would mean an agonizing, incurable, and certain death. This was a power that would serve him well in his future labors. It would be this venom that would allow him to defeat the fleet-footed Ceryneian hind, to slay the giant Geryon, and to overcome other foes that his strength alone might not have been enough to conquer. But this act of practical advantage was also an act of profound, tragic irony. In taking the Hydra's poison, Heracles had, in a very real sense, allowed the plague of Lerna to leave the swamp with him. He had conquered the blight, only to carry its most potent seed with him for the rest of his days. And this seed of the Hydra would, in the end, be the cause of his own undoing. Years later, after his labors were complete, Heracles and his wife, Deianira, would have a fateful encounter with a centaur named Nessus. As Nessus was carrying Deianira across a raging river, he was overcome with lust and tried to assault her. Heracles, seeing this from the far bank, drew his bow without hesitation. He fired one of his Hydra-poisoned arrows, striking the centaur deep in the chest. Nessus, dying and in agony from the incurable poison, decided to enact a final, terrible revenge. With his dying breath, he spoke to the distraught Deianira. This was all a misunderstanding, he lied, his voice slick with false sincerity. But I can give you a gift. Take my blood, for it is now mixed with a powerful love charm from the arrow that struck me. If you ever feel your husband's love for you is fading, spread this blood upon his tunic, and he will never love another woman but you. Diana, trusting and desperate to secure her husband's love, collected the centaur's blood, not knowing that it was now hopelessly, fatally contaminated with the very poison of the Lernaean Hydra. Years after that, when she feared that Heracles' eye had wandered to another woman, she remembered the centaur's words. She took a fine tunic and, with loving hands, she spread the so-called love charm upon it. She gave it to her husband as a gift. When Heracles put on the tunic, the warmth of his own heroic, demigod body activated the Hydra's ancient poison. It began to burn him alive. The tunic clung to his skin, searing his flesh from his bones. The pain was absolute, an agony so profound that even the mighty Heracles, who had held up the sky itself, was brought to his knees, screaming in torment. He tried to tear the tunic off, but it only pulled his own flesh away with it. He had faced and defeated countless monsters, but he could not defeat this. He could not defeat the lingering, vengeful ghost of his own second labor. The poison was incurable, and so, in his final moments, to escape the unbearable, burning agony, he built his own funeral pyre on Mount Ida and had it lit. His mighty body consumed by a fire as purifying as the one Iolaus had once used to save him. The hero's life, a life of unparalleled strength and victory, was ended by the very plague he had so famously conquered. His victory at Lerna was, in the end, a tainted one, a victory that had planted the seed of his own, terrible and agonizing death. The second labor was complete. But what Heracles had truly done that day in the swamp was not to simply slay a monster. He had performed a terrifying act of supernatural surgery, cutting away the cancerous, ever-growing growths of a sentient plague and cauterizing the wounds with fire. He had driven the disease into a deep, powerless remission. He had buried its immortal heart, and then he had unwittingly and fatally taken a sample of the virus with him, a virus that would one day claim its final and greatest victim. Sometimes, the monsters we face are not beasts of flesh and blood, but creeping, insidious plagues that grow stronger from our own attacks. And sometimes, a hero's greatest victory is not in killing the monster, but in learning how to stop it from spreading. Thank you for journeying with us to the swamps of Lerna. If this unveiling of a classic monster has infected your imagination, show your support by liking this video, subscribing to Mythos Unveiled, and hitting the notification bell so you never miss another journey into the heart of our most terrifying legends. What other mythological beast do you believe holds a deeper, more secret nature? Let us know in the comments. Until next time, be wary of battles where every victory only creates more enemies.